At exactly 12:12 in the morning, my phone rang, and my son's voice on the other end was shaking so badly I almost couldn't understand him. He said, "Dad, your name is on the CNBC News app." What the hell did you do? I want you to sit with that for a second, because that phone call changed everything I thought I knew about my own family, and to understand how I got there, I need to take you back to a dinner table 3 weeks earlier, the night my wife looked me in the eye and told me it was best if I didn't come to the cottage for Christmas. My name is Richard Farrow, and this is the story of the strangest holiday of my entire life. I should tell you a little about who I was before all this happened, because it matters. I was 51 years old, married to a woman named Diane for 22 years, and for most of those years, I genuinely believed we had a good marriage. Not perfect, nobody's is, but solid. Steady. We had one son together, Caleb, 20 years old, away at college 3 states over, the kind of kid who calls his dad more than most kids his age, which I never took for granted. Diane came from money, old money, the kind with a family cottage on a lake up north that had been passed down for 3 generations, a place her mother, Eleanor, guarded like it was a sacred temple and not just a house with a dock. I worked in commercial real estate, mid-level, nothing flashy, good enough to support us comfortably but never quite good enough, in Eleanor's eyes, to be considered a real match for her daughter. Eleanor never said this outright. She didn't have to. She said it in the way she introduced me at parties. This is Diane's husband, never just Richard, always positioned as an accessory to her daughter rather than a person in his own right. I'd learned, over 2 decades, to let it roll off me. Diane, at least, had always been in my corner, or so I thought. Every Christmas for 22 years, without exception, we went to that cottage. It was tradition, and honestly, despite Eleanor's coldness toward me, I loved those trips. The snow on the pine trees, the fireplace, Caleb as a little boy building snowmen on the dock, all of it. So you can imagine my confusion when, 3 weeks before Christmas this past year, Diane set down her fork at dinner, folded her hands like she'd rehearsed this moment, and said, "It's best if you don't come to the cottage this Christmas. My mother said you've been so difficult." Difficult. That was the word she used. I remember asking her, difficult how, and she just shrugged and said her mother had been under a lot of stress lately and didn't want any tension during the holiday. I pushed harder, because 22 years of Christmases doesn't just end over vague stress, and Diane got defensive fast, said I was making a simple request into a bigger deal than it needed to be, said maybe I should use the time to relax at home instead. I want to be honest with you about how that felt. It felt like being quietly erased from my own family's tradition, being told, essentially, that after 2 decades of showing up, cooking, shoveling snow off that long driveway every single year, I was suddenly the problem, and nobody could even tell me specifically what I'd done wrong. I asked Caleb about it later that week, called him at college, and even he sounded uneasy, said his grandmother had mentioned something about adult matters that didn't concern him, which was strange, because Caleb usually knew everything happening in our family before I did. If you've ever felt shut out of your own life by people who were supposed to love you the most, I think you'll understand exactly why I started paying closer attention after that dinner. And if this story is already pulling you in, go ahead and subscribe now, because trust me, what I found over those 3 weeks before Christmas is not what I expected at all, and I promise you the ending is worth sticking around for. I started paying attention the way you do when something feels wrong but you can't name it yet. Diane's phone, which used to sit face up on the kitchen counter like it always had for 22 years, started disappearing into her purse or her coat pocket the second she walked in the door. She began taking calls in the bathroom with the fan running, which she used to make fun of her sister for doing, calling it suspicious wife behavior, like it was a joke between us. Now she was doing it herself, and it didn't feel like a joke anymore. Then came the emails. I want to explain how I found them, because I wasn't snooping through her phone or breaking into anything, I promise you that. We shared a family email account for years, one we'd set up back when Caleb was in middle school, mostly used for school forms and utility bills, something we both had access to and honestly both forgot still existed most of the time. One evening, checking it for a delivery confirmation, I found a forwarded email chain between Diane and her mother, Eleanor, going back almost 2 months. The subject line alone made my stomach drop, Richard and the Hartwell land deal. I hadn't touched anything called the Hartwell land deal in my life. I didn't recognize the name at all. But reading through that email chain, my hands actually went cold, because Eleanor was writing to Diane about a piece of undeveloped lakefront property near the cottage, land that Eleanor's family had quietly owned for decades through an old holding trust, land that, according to this email chain, a development company had recently offered an enormous sum of money to buy, specifically because of new zoning approvals for a resort complex. And buried in the middle of that email chain, Eleanor had written something that still makes my chest tighten thinking about it: we need to keep Richard away from all of this until the sale closes. If he finds out what that land is actually worth now, and what the family discussed years ago about his name being on the original deed paperwork by mistake, it could complicate everything. Keep him distracted through Christmas. I'll handle it after. I read that sentence probably 15 times before it fully sank in. My name. On deed paperwork. For land worth, based on numbers mentioned further down in that email chain, somewhere close to $11 million once the resort deal went through. I want to slow down here, because I need you to understand, I had absolutely no idea any of this existed. Years earlier, back when Caleb was a toddler, Eleanor had asked me to co-sign some paperwork related to a family trust restructuring, told me it was just a formality to help with estate planning, nothing that would ever actually involve me directly. I signed it because I trusted my wife's family, because that's what you do when you're trying to be a good son-in-law even to a woman who barely respects you. I had completely forgotten about it. Eleanor, apparently, had not. So now the picture was becoming horribly clear. Eleanor and Diane were trying to quietly finalize a massive land sale before I could find out that my name, through some old paperwork technicality, might actually give me a legal claim to a piece of that $11 million deal. And keeping me away from the cottage this Christmas wasn't about me being difficult. It was about keeping me distracted and out of the way while lawyers finalized everything without my knowledge. I did what any reasonable person would do. I hired my own attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Nguyen who specialized in property and estate law, and I brought her everything, the email chain, the old trust documents I still had copies of from years earlier, all of it. Patricia confirmed within days what I was starting to suspect. That old paperwork I'd signed hadn't just been a formality. It had, through a technical structuring choice made by Eleanor's own estate lawyer at the time, actually listed me as a minor beneficial interest holder in that specific parcel of land, something worth almost nothing back then, but now, with the resort deal on the table, worth a very real percentage of $11 million. Here's where it gets even messier. Patricia discovered that Eleanor's lawyers had already drafted paperwork attempting to quietly restructure the trust again, removing my name entirely, dated to be signed and filed the week of Christmas, while Diane and Eleanor were up at the cottage, conveniently, exactly when I would have been out of the picture and unaware anything was happening. I confronted Diane about all of this 2 days before Christmas. I didn't yell. I actually surprised myself with how calm I stayed, because underneath the anger, honestly, what I mostly felt was heartbreak. 22 years of marriage, and my own wife had chosen to help her mother quietly cut me out of a multi-million-dollar deal rather than just have an honest conversation with me. When I laid the email chain in front of her on our kitchen table, Diane didn't even try to deny it right away. She just went very pale and said, "It's complicated, Richard. My mother said it would be easier this way." Easier for who? I asked her. She didn't have an answer to that. She told me, eventually, that Eleanor had convinced her that if I found out about my legal claim to the land, I might try to take a bigger share than I deserved, might ruin the family's plans, her words, not mine, as if I was some outsider threatening to invade their finances instead of the man who had been part of that family for over 2 decades. I asked Diane directly whether she agreed with her mother, whether she genuinely thought I deserved nothing, and she looked away instead of answering, which honestly told me everything I needed to know. I spent Christmas Eve alone in our house, exactly like Diane had originally asked, except now I understood precisely why she wanted me gone. Caleb, once I finally explained the full situation to him over the phone, was furious on my behalf, offered to skip his own holiday plans and come sit with me instead, but I told him to go be with his friends, that I'd be alright, and mostly, I meant it. I felt strange being alone in that big empty house on Christmas Eve after 22 years of tradition, but underneath the sadness, there was something else too, a kind of clarity I hadn't felt in a long time. With Patricia's help, working through the holidays because she understood exactly how urgent this was, we filed an emergency legal notice freezing any further action on that land trust until my ownership interest could be formally reviewed and confirmed by the court. That notice went through on December 23, 2 days before Eleanor's lawyers were planning to quietly finalize everything at the cottage. And this is where that phone call comes back in, the one I opened this story with. Because once that legal filing went public record, once the development company backing the resort deal realized there was now an unresolved ownership dispute attached to a major piece of the land they were trying to purchase, the story leaked, fast, first through local business circles, then picked up by a regional business reporter, and by the time it reached CNBC's markets and real estate section, it had become a small but genuinely newsworthy story about a family trust dispute complicating an $11 million resort land deal, and my name, Richard Farrow, was right there in the headline as the previously unlisted co-owner whose claim had frozen the sale. That's the call Caleb made to me at 12:12 in the morning on Christmas, panicked, having stumbled across the article on his phone while scrolling before bed, seeing his own father's name attached to a financial news story he had absolutely no context for. I remember laughing, actually laughing, for the first time in weeks, as I explained the whole thing to him over the phone, because after everything, after being told I wasn't welcome at my own family's Christmas, after discovering my wife and mother-in-law tried to quietly cut me out of millions of dollars, there was something almost poetic about the truth breaking out into the open on the exact night I was supposed to have been kept in the dark. If you've made it this far into the story, I really appreciate you sticking with me, and if you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe, because what happened over the following months, the court proceedings, my marriage, and where I ended up, might honestly surprise you even more than what you've heard so far. The legal process took nearly 5 months to fully resolve. In the end, the court confirmed what Patricia had suspected from the start, that my name on that old trust paperwork gave me a legitimate, legally binding claim to a meaningful share of the land's value, roughly $2.4 million once the resort deal eventually closed under renegotiated terms. Eleanor fought it every step of the way, spent what I can only imagine was a small fortune in legal fees trying to argue I had no real claim, but the paperwork, ironically the same paperwork she'd once dismissed to me as just a formality, was airtight. Diane and I separated during those 5 months. Not immediately, not dramatically, just a slow, quiet unraveling once the truth was fully out in the open. I think what broke something permanently between us wasn't even the money, honestly. It was realizing that when it came down to a real choice between protecting me and protecting her mother's wishes, she'd chosen her mother without much hesitation, and worse, she'd been willing to let me spend an entire Christmas alone, cut out of my own family tradition, just to buy her and Eleanor a little more time. We finalized our divorce quietly the following spring. It was sad, genuinely sad. 22 years doesn't just evaporate without leaving something behind, but it also felt, in a strange way, like finally being honest about something that had been cracked for longer than I wanted to admit. Caleb, to his enormous credit, made it clear early on that he wasn't choosing sides in some family war, but he also didn't hide how angry he was at how his grandmother and mother had handled things. He spent that following Christmas with me instead, just the two of us, at a small rented cabin nowhere near that lake, and honestly, it turned out to be one of the best Christmases I can remember. Quiet, simple, no old tensions hanging in the air, just my son and me, a fireplace, and actual honesty between us for once. As for the money, I used a good portion of it to help Caleb finish school without loans, invested the rest carefully, and finally, for the first time in over 2 decades, felt like I had built something that was entirely, unquestionably my own, not something I was quietly tolerated for being attached to. I still think about that email sometimes, the line where Eleanor wrote that they needed to keep me distracted through Christmas. In a strange way, I'm almost grateful for how clumsy that plan turned out to be, because if they'd handled it just a little more carefully, I might never have found out the truth at all, and I might still be sitting at that cottage every Christmas, smiling politely at a family that had already decided, quietly, that I didn't really belong there. I learned something from all of this that I think about often now. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the very ones drawing the lines that leave you standing outside in the cold, and sometimes the only way you find out the truth is when it becomes too big, too public, too undeniable for anyone to keep hiding it from you any longer. If this story resonated with you at all, please subscribe to the channel, because there are more stories exactly like this one coming every week, and honestly, hearing from all of you in the comments about your own experiences has meant more to me than you probably realize. Thank you for listening to mine.